Good morning, campers. Welcome to Radio Camp Half-Blood, a Percy Jackson read-along podcast, and I am your host, Zach.
And I'm B.
And this week we read Chapter 7, My Dinner Goes Up in Smoke. What did you think of this chapter, B?
This is just in the wake of Percy's weird showing of powers.
In his bathroom escapade?
Because he is a toilet demigod.
Oh, wow, spoilers.
The god of the toilets, he sits upon the throne. Okay, I'm sorry, that's really bad. I'm just gonna backpedal a little bit.
You see this, son? All these toilets as far as the eye can see, but what about the dark parts? Oh, we don't go near the dark parts. Those are alleyways.
From here to the elephant graveyard. So this is like the chapter where Annabeth kind of fills him in on a lot of inside baseball stuff about the camp, basically. And it's interesting.
You pretty much get like a sit rep on what's going on.
Yeah, it's interesting too because she kind of presumes that he knows some things sometimes, and she's like, oh yeah, of course, this thing. And he's like, I don't know a thing, even though I'm technically a half-blood or whatever. I don't really know any of the stuff you're talking about.
But we get like a huge like reality bomb. Finally, we get to know the answer that we've known for a very long time, and that's Percy is a vampire. Oh, wait, no, a demigod. It just like Annabelle texts him to the woods, say it, say what I am. And Percy's like, oh, I'm a vampire.
Imagine he was also a vampire. That would like really complicate things.
In the weird Twilight AU fan fiction.
Oh, I bet that absolutely exists, and that like makes me sad.
You know, anytime like you think of anything that's kid literature, and then in certain, I'm pretty sure there's also like a Hunger Games one. There has to be a Hunger Games.
Oh
one.
Yeah, Hunger Games for sure. Statistically speaking, someone listening to this could have been a person who wrote crossover fan fiction between Percy Jackson and the Hunger Games. Like that's how.
B, do you hear that?
What is that?
I'm hearing like a pterodactyl screech from halfway across this world. It's almost like a great disturbance in the force, as if one person that wrote fan fictions cried out at once and then was suddenly silenced, and how stupid it was written.
Yeah. I'm not making fun of people who write fan fiction, like live your truth.
I'm not.
But yeah, basically every crossover has been written. That's just kind of how it is. I feel like there was definitely like a stretch of time in kind of the early 2000s when basically any like popular young adult series was always kind of mushed together with other popular young adult series and just made into a Frankenstein monster, which is fine.
I mean, that's just a normal thing that happens because, you know, interesting enough, fan fictions have been a thing all the way up into the 60s. That's when they really actually, I think the very first popular fan fiction was actually, I might be getting this wrong because I don't know my fan fiction history correctly, but the first one was like people would mail it to each other, and it was a gay fan fiction of Spock and Kirk.
Of Spock and Kirk, yeah. I'm pretty sure that's where it originated from, also. That's what I've heard, anyway.
And also that's where the term Mary Sue came from, if I remember correctly.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
Because there was a Star Trek fan fiction where the character was named Mary Sue, and she was great at everything. And then that's kind of where it spawned from there, if I remember correctly. I don't know my fan fiction history all that well.
Only you know it. You know it more than a lot of people. Aside from that, I liked this chapter. I like the feeling of, like, being immersed in the canon of the universe, that you, like, get information, and, like, I mean, it's hard, especially, like, I've mentioned this before with, like, any kind of fantasy constructed universe thing, where you have to provide a certain amount of exposition for it to make sense. Like, there's a lot of world building involved in fantasy, even if it's, you know, based on something like myth, which is kind of more in like the cultural consciousness of like, oh, people kind of vaguely know who Zeus is or whatever. But like, I think they do a pretty good job of conveying just enough information about like how this world works, how specifically Camp Half-Blood works, like, you know, who different sort of people are, like what are the words that they use, like what is the vocabulary that they specifically use to refer to demigods as half-bloods, whatever. Like they do a good job of doing that without it seeming too like, and then this is a thing we do here. Like
the term that I coined for that was, you know, conveyor belt exposition, where, you know, you can just have like Percy and Annabeth literally standing on a conveyor belt while they see scenes going through, and it's like, well, here is the sword armory, this is where you kill monsters, and this is where we have our oracle that gives us prophecies. I think the best way to put this also is like there's books like The Way of the Kings or The King Killer Chronicles where you're like thrown into this world.
Yeah, it's like in media res kind of thing where it's just like...
basically you are trying to like, you're swimming and trying to dog paddle, and it takes like a couple of readings to understand.
I think because of the way that Percy Jackson works, this kind of exposition makes sense because he isn't being immediately thrown into a crazy conflict. He's going to a camp, much like Harry Potter would go to Hogwarts or whatever, where it's like, this is kind of like your introductory place where you learn about the things that have broader impacts in like the world, sort of. So if you're doing that kind of construction, then it makes sense for you to be like, okay, here's like this sort of softball tutorial of all the different stuff that we think and talk about, and like, here's the food that we eat and whatever, and it doesn't have to be so like, I don't know what's going on, and then like he's, you know, gradually just figuring things out from context clues. Like, he can actually ask questions because he's basically going through orientation or something, right? Like, that's basically the issue.
So Percy is pretty much like trying to learn the rules of the camp, while us as the audience are trying to learn the rules of the camp. And, you know, as it goes on, things will be less like self-explanatory, and you'll start to learn more things.
It benefits from the fact that he's an idiot. Do you know what I mean? Like, that he hasn't heard anything about anything. Like, it doesn't assume anything. So then he's just like, no, but I don't know what that means. What's the oracle? Like, he doesn't, you know.
Well, I think the best thing also about it, and people might hate what I'm about to say, is that it's really good that Percy is a very basic human being.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't have a very distinct personality in the beginning.
In the beginning especially, which is, I mean, again, super, like, just like a children's lit thing to do. Like, I mean, to some extent, they oftentimes will give like a distinct, like one distinct trait to a kid, like usually like a physical feature, like they always would like focus on how Harry had messy hair or something like that.
Or
but like
he had
for
green eyes, his mother's eyes.
Which they totally didn't even do in the movie, which is the whole thing.
Well, I mean, I can defend that because Daniel Radcliffe put on green contacts, but he had an allergic reaction, so he tried.
They could have CG'd it, regardless.
That would have been super expensive, though.
Yeah, probably would have. Okay, never mind. I don't really care enough about Harry Potter to argue whether or not it was worth it for them to have different...
Well, I mean, they could have done it in the close-up shots and in like, the wide shots.
Or, like, they could have also cast someone as his mom with the same color eyes, but she also has different eyes than him, too.
So what a conundrum.
For the most part, children's literature follows, like, this formula where it's, like, especially when you're introduced to a character, it's like, these kids are just like you. I think that's definitely...
But different.
That's definitely true of, like, something like a Goosebumps book, which really, like, functions on the ability for the kid reading it to, like, relate to whatever the protagonist is.
This is a good subject of, we can segue actually into one of the things I'd like to talk about, which is the difference between kids' books and young adult.
I mean, it's just made up, right?
They're just made up categories, pretty much. Like, I would consider a lot of books, like, in the fantasy genre, such as, I want to use a prime example that just came out, was Ready Player One. I don't consider that a science fiction fantasy book. I consider it a young adult book, because essentially a young adult book is someone growing up.
Yeah, that's true. It's usually a coming-of-age thing.
It's a coming-of-age thing, because the whole core argument of that book is basically growing up and actually accepting reality as a real thing rather than...
Yeah, I feel like modern young adult literature in general, like, was, and this is, like, the reason why we reference Harry Potter so much, is, like, it really was sort of forged under that template, basically, where it's like, oh, well, it starts off with, like, a simpler kind of story and introduces you to kind of the more basic, like, fantastical elements of this world, and it gradually gets darker, and then as
your main hero starts growing up, you grow up along the way.
Yeah, exactly, which is, like, totally, like, a thing that they marketed that way, and that's definitely...
Same as with, another example I can give is just, all it really is just a category. We put it in young adult because it follows those parameters, but you can also, like, look at, like a mystery story. There's different categories of mystery. There's a cozy mystery that takes place in, like, a small little town. And then there's parlor mysteries that really just take place in, like, a gigantic mansion, like Clue. All it is just categories.
I mean, like, children's literature obviously is, like, way more broad, too, because, like, you can include, like, really basic picture books and board books and things like that in children's literature. So it's, like, it's sort of like the rectangle square thing, where, like, all young adult fiction is kind of, like, under a broader umbrella of children's fiction. It's just, like, for an older audience typically, and it follows, like, different, like, a formula usually that is used in other young adult books. Well, I feel like children's literature is, like, anything is children's, like, you know, Pet the Bunny is a children's book. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's...
Well, I would consider, if you go to Barnes & Noble or any of your booksellers in any of the countries you go to, usually when you go into the kids section, they'll have it labeled young adult or kids books, and they'll have, like, 8 through 12 or something. I would consider young adult starting
like 12, usually,
12,
right?
Like, when you're trying to get more into teen fiction, but that's another category. But really, I consider, young adult and kids books really being when you start reading chapter books with no pictures in them. Kids books are like picture books like Dr. Seuss and like very basic core reading. But once you start getting to chapter books and you're dealing with more...
or like Maurice Sendak, anything like that, like Where the Wild Things Are. There's like, all that kind of stuff, which is like, not to say that like those are any less important or interesting than young adult books. It's just like, it's marketing and stuff, basically.
So they're important for a kid's development rather than...
I mean, until pretty recently, young adult also wasn't a thing that people used. Like, they just said children's books, and it was just kind of like a general category. But I think like it was sort of implied that it's like vaguely insulting to point to a kid who's reading Harry Potter and be like, oh, you're reading a kid's book, because it was just like such a zeitgeist that like everyone was reading it. You didn't want to like sort of demean to a kid and be like, oh, this is for children what you're reading, because a lot of times it did gradually get darker and more complicated in terms of plot, and it got longer.
It's just a nice way of saying chapter book.
Yeah.
Or teen fiction, or they're just categories, because if you go into a bookstore and let's just say every book was labeled kids books, how would you find the core books you're looking for? If you mixed in the Harry Potters with the Lord of the Rings, with the To Kill a Mockingbirds.
To Kill a Mockingbird is complicated because I feel like that's
a kid's book. That is a young adult book.
I mean, it wasn't.
You follow a set of kids and they grow up.
That's true. I mean, it accidentally kind of did that, but because it was like written before young adult was a thing, it wasn't written for kids. You read it now in high school because it's like a part of the canon or whatever. But To Kill a Mockingbird was just like very much just like the story that Harper Lee kind of had in her about her childhood. And as a lot of people know, Go Set a Watchman was like the original idea of what she wanted to do with that story, which would have been her as an adult, which a lot of people would say, oh, Go Set a Watchman is not a book for young adults, but it's essentially the same story told from a different time period.
Well, I mean, then you can look at the same thing about like Tom Sawyer, which in theory is supposed to be an adult book, but it's from the perspective of a kid, so thus it's young adult kid literature.
Yeah, that's another weird thing, too.
All the book is, Tom Sawyer, is a satirical look at the South through the eyes of a kid.
Yeah, and it's also, like, I remember reading, I think it was maybe Huck Finn when I was a kid, and I remember my mom being like, you're a little young for this, because there's, like, a lot of, like, dark kind of elements, and I was, like, pretty young, too. I think it was, like, 8 or something, and I was just like, yeah, I just read Huck Finn, and she was like, were you not scared about all of the dangers? Also, there's like weird racism stuff that happens in that too, with like...
Well, I mean, that's done intentionally because Mark Twain actually was an abolitionist.
Yeah, he was, but like in terms of just like the way that they talk about Native Americans and stuff, like whatever. There's some sketchy things.
We got to look at it when it was written.
Yeah, that's true within the context, but yeah, there's a lot of like dark things.
See, that's like that's the problem with, especially like with media that's over 20 years. You can't look at it from a modern perspective. You need to look at it
from the context. Yeah, and at the time it wasn't. Yeah, if anything, it was trying to be progressive in what it was saying, but it did have characters like Injun Joe in Tom Sawyer, where it's just like, oh god, this like...
Well, that's how they said it. That was the problem. That was the thing in the South. No one would understand if you said Native American Joe.
Really demonized as a character. Have you ever seen the Mark Twain claymation that was made in the 80s?
No.
It's really horrifying, and if you really want to feel like you're having a really bad trip, watch that movie. I think it's still on Netflix. But there's a moment where basically the general idea of the story is like these kids go on this adventure on this magical flying spaceship thing with Mark Twain as he's like about to die because Halley's Comet is coming back. Are you sure
this isn't like a Beatles music video?
It looks a lot like a Beatles music video. And basically like the spaceship kind of represents like his mind and all the different stories that it contains. So at one point this kid opens a door and it's just Injun Joe like running towards him with like not even like a human face really. He has like this like animalistic kind of like fanged look to him, like he doesn't even look like a person, and it's horrifying. It's like the scariest claymation thing I've ever seen, and I just watched Coraline, so I can say for a fact that I've seen some scary stop motion shit, but yeah, that's, oh my god. So watch that if you want to be really freaked out. Anyway, we're getting kind of off the rails, but basically, yeah, young adult is kind of a nebulous category.
So basically, to answer this question in a very roundabout way,
it means nothing. Nothing means anything.
Reality is a myth, and everyone should go buy gold.
Buy gold now.
So back to demigods.
Back to demigods. Anyway, so yeah, they do a pretty good job of making Percy oblivious just enough for it to make sense for him to ask a bunch of questions and for Annabeth to kind of fill him in. Also, Annabeth is a great character because unlike Chiron, who has kind of a stake in not revealing maybe too much or like not being super honest about how he feels about
Annabeth is Percy's age.
Yeah, Annabeth is a kid, so she, at least emotionally, right? How old is she actually? I don't even know.
She's the same age as Percy. She was there since she was 7, so it's about 4 years. So yeah, just about the same age.
Yeah, so they're like about the same age, and she kind of tells it like it is in terms of like she kind of like is kind of annoyed about certain aspects of things, I guess, which is like...
Well, I mean, it's kind of like... So I would consider it this way. If you do like work, it's like Creon's the foreman, and Annabeth is just another employee trying to help the new hire adjust to the work. Whereas it's much easier to talk to someone that's in the same situation as you than basically the head of the company.
Yeah. Well, like, there's even, like, that scene earlier in the book where, like, Percy sees, like, something in the attic window, and Chiron just kind of, like, changes the subject and kind of, like, clears his throat, and he's like, oh, whatever, I don't know what you're talking about, there's no one in there. Well, like, Annabeth is definitely more straight up with him because she has, like, nothing...
Like, oh, yeah, that's the Oracle.
Yeah, she has nothing to hide in this regard, and she's not... If anything, she thinks that Percy knows more than he does.
Well, I mean, and then I guess in defense of Chiron is that, you know, how much do you reveal? How much information should one give to a person that's new? And how much, you know, they're willing to comprehend?
Yeah, exactly. Especially because, like, from what...
Creon's been doing this for, like,
Yeah, he's also kind of jaded,
years.
too, right? Like, he's mentioned that he has helped a lot of quote-unquote heroes in the past, and he's kind of, like...
He's helped Hercules, for one. I think he's also helped Jason.
So, like, it's not in his best interest to be like, here's all of the worst parts of this, because he's obviously seen a lot of it.
He comes back down to what I like to call whimsical horror.
Whimsical horror. You mean my life?
Yeah, that's actually my new biography. Originally was supposed to be called Fantastic Beast and Where to Find Him, but I was going to get a cease and desist letter.
Yeah, it's fine. I like how they kind of set up the way that monsters function in this world. Like, they talk about how, for whatever reason, monsters can't come into the camp unless they're summoned through something, so that really does kind of set off, like, a Chekhov's monster? I don't know, like, where it's just like...
It's a Chekhov's gun, whereas it's like... Camp Half-Blood is the only safe place you can go to if you're a demigod. If not, you're it.
Yeah. Also, like, there's kind of an implication that's like all you need is for someone to summon a monster for them to be entered into the camp. Also, they said that they even do that as pranks. So, like, all I'm saying is, like, as far as what's protecting them, it's kind of very easily bypassed.
It's just like, I would consider Camp Half-Blood like breathing room, so you can actually, like, learn and fight, because remember, they do talk about, Annabeth again talks about how Percy's a demigod, but there's also like demigods. I mean, yeah, and especially like here, it's like you basically train here until you're strong enough to actually survive in the real world, which I guess... But
there is sort of a dependency, which is kind of scary, right? Because it's like, oh, we're telling you that this is the only safe place and you have to be here and you have to be trained in this certain way, but like, you're just also taking the word of whatever Chiron and everybody else who's running the camp is saying, right? Like, because Percy doesn't know anything before this. He's just being, like, introduced to all of this crazy world-building stuff that's happening where they're explaining how everything works, and he just is, like, taking it at face value. And then, of course, some kids are, like, born into it and immediately go there. Like, Annabeth has been there for a long time.
Yeah, and then you have things... It also depends on who your parents are, so it's, like... There's, like, a weird... I think of it like Dragon Ball Z, what's your power level?
I don't know about Dragon Ball Z. Was I even alive in the 90s?
Don't you know anything about the 90s? No,
only 90s kids remember.
I remember snap bracelets and chia pets.
Okay, I remember those too. My chia pet died. My chia pet never grew. It just sat there with the seeds on it, and then it died.
You have power level structures of which, like, oh, if you're like a very lesser god, you could just like live a normal life and nothing will bother you. But if you're like a super powerful like you're basically potent.
Yeah. There's also the obvious implication that Percy is the son of a powerful god because he's had such an issue with dealing with like these monsters popping up and like, you know,
which if you really think about it, being a demigod for the most part kind of sucks a little bit because you're essentially doomed a life of fighting, and I would imagine like the life expectancy is very low. Like the average, how long you live for?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I've always felt that, like, kind of hero's journey stories in general, like, never appealed to me. Like, the idea of being, like, a chosen one and then having to, like, do this thing that's prophesized by something that came long before you about how you have to fight these things, and you have to, like, suffer a great deal of loss, and, like, it's...
You're gonna suffer before you become happy?
Yeah, it's just... That doesn't really appeal to me as a story. Like, I think a lot of kids really do find a lot of enjoyment in stories like that, and they really are just like, oh man, what if I was not just like this normal kid in math class, and I too could be whisked away to Camp Half-Blood and be like a hero or whatever. But, like, I wouldn't want any of those things. Like, that doesn't sound fun.
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on, one, your personality, and how much, like, when you're really... listeners, if you really think about it, think of it this way. When you're really in the situation here, where you basically, you're against your life, and you're going to be suffering a lot, is it worth, I think the leap also when it comes to leadership, is are you willing to compromise with your own happiness rather than, the greater good?
Yeah.
Or, like, does the one outweigh the needs of the many, or does the many needs the ways of the few?
Yeah, it's why, for some reason, a lot of kids are, like, really drawn to the idea of, like, being the person, like, the chosen one, and, like, that they have to go on, like, this big adventure, because, like, I never really related to that.
Ideas of, I might have a boring life, but really, I'm this real... It's the Clark Kent effect of how, look at Clark Kent, average man who really is Superman.
That's definitely, like, the appeal of something like Camp Half-Blood or Hogwarts, right? Where it's like, oh, you're a normal kid, but then when you turn a certain age, you're going to find out that you're more special than you realized you were in some way or another. I mean, even, like, we talked about this, I think, with, like, Disney Channel original movies really leaned into this hard, where it's just like, you're 13 and you're a mermaid now, where it's just like, all of a sudden, yeah, like, the metaphor for puberty is basically turning into a magical creature in some aspect or another, and it's like, that's just, I don't know, I guess I understand that aspect to some extent, because, like, when you're just, like, this weird kid who gets bullied all the time, it is kind of like... And, of course, it is often the weird kids who are reading the books about kids going on adventures.
At that point, then it also becomes a very cathartic experience of just being able to, like, rise up from your terrible surroundings. Because if you look at it, if we look at the core argument of Harry Potter and Percy Jackson and Series of Unfortunate Events, to the most part, before we get into...
Unfortunate Events is more complicated than that, a little bit, but yeah.
I'm just saying, but it's like... The very core theme of the story. We have Harry Potter. Thanks, guys, for donating to our show with every penny from this pot.
We should be sponsored by Harry Potter. Only I don't want to be, because J.K. Rowling is not my favorite. But that's another story.
Is that Harry Potter is the story of an abused child, like severely abused, like to the point of where he's locked up in a cupboard. He is starved. He's basically told his entire life that he'll be nothing and that his parents were nothing and drunks. And he rises up, and in the end, he leaves. That's the whole core thing of the story, is you can be a battered, terribly treated child. And that
his way out is in a magical way, but the whole point is that, first of all, he's able to escape his circumstances, and second of all, he has some sort of, like, secret magic ingredient to himself that makes him more powerful than the people who originally abused him. He gets to make the glass disappear and have, his horrible... cousin fall in and, like, get attacked by a snake or whatever. And it's the same thing with Percy. It's like, oh, well, Percy is kind of like this, problem child who gets moved around from, reform school to reform school, trying to deal with all these, like, different kind of delinquent kids who, like, bully him and, like, whatever. But then his powers, like, overtake that. And he does something like, Nancy Boba Fett, right? When Boba Fett, like, tries to bully him on the top of the roof or whatever, then all of a sudden his powers take over and pushes her into a fountain. Or when he gets a swirly, he does the same thing.
You also have the ideas of, as a kid, especially with me growing up with, like, learning disabilities and stuff, is like, having the idea of, like, normalcy and, like, why am I different from any other person? But then, like, you get to this camp and everyone's pretty much the same way.
We're being different than the typical kid is, like, a strength somehow. It's like, here's the explanation for why you're so weird. Here's all of, like, the culmination of, like, why you haven't been able to fit in, why you keep getting kicked out of schools, why you can't read the way other people can read, why you can't pay attention. It's all actually a power. Yeah, exactly. Which I definitely see why that appeals to certain kids. I was actually just thinking also of even, like, a story like James and the Giant Peach, where it's, like, actually, it's, like, super similar to the Harry Potter model, where He's abused.
James is completely abused by his two aunts.
And he doesn't, he's an orphan. That's like a really common theme in kids lit too, to get rid of their parents.
Well, I mean, okay, so the reason why every kid's an orphan, we can just talk about this right now, is that if you have the parents involved, they would not let their kid go on an adventure. They need to either be dead or completely out of the picture.
Yeah, they'd be like, come home. Yeah, usually in those kind of stories, either the parents are dead, or sometimes if it's a little bit more of like a sanitized version of that story, it'll be something where they'll like fall into some sort of magical thing and they'll disappear for hours, but then they'll come back and it has only been a short while. Like something like Chronicles of Narnia, which is a similar thing. Or like even thinking of like, like that dumb made-for-TV movie I saw. What is the one I'm thinking of? The Bookmaster? Is that what that's called? The Bookmaster?
The Page Master?
The Page Master, yeah. It's like the same thing where this kid has like an issue in his day-to-day life and it's solved through like...
He has like a phobia of everything. He has a fear of statistics.
Yeah, he gets whisked away to a magical circumstance that helps him in his day-to-day life.
And then in the end, he like jumps over, he does dangerous things, he builds a treehouse and all that wonderful
stuff. Which is
stuff.
too dangerous, to be honest. He overcorrected, but that's a different thing.
But then the problem with that, I also find, this is just me because I like reality, is if you look at Chronicles of Narnia, it's like all of them grow up to be in their like 40s to 60s.
And then they come back and they're kids.
And then they come back and be kids again, and it's like, this is...
Oh, that's like so messed up, that part.
It's like you think about it as just like you've basically become this adult and you have all these adult feelings, but now you're a kid again and you're basically back to square one.
Honestly, I get why children's books are like constructed that way, because that's, I think, especially when you're like preteen and adolescent, there is a really common feeling, even if you're like the most popular kid in school, there is a sense of like alienation, that you're like, there's something weird about you that like everyone else can see right through you, and that you're like, oh, I'm not as good at these social scripts as everyone else, and everyone else is doing so much better. That, well, of course, everyone internally is freaking out the exact same way that you are.
Well, yeah, no, there's no change in that. That's, everyone's different, other in unique ways. And especially with young adult and coming of age stories, it's like really the core theme of all those stories is truly finding out who you want to be rather than being the same. Like, I think like in Fairly Odd Parents where Timmy wishes everyone's the same so they all become like gray blobs.
Yeah.
It's like that. That's what I think of. Like everyone starts off as gray blobs, but then they start maturing into their colorful selves, such as the movie Pleasantville, which is actually, that movie's more about race, but same thing. It's about finding who yourself is.
I haven't seen that movie in a while. I remember liking it, but I don't remember the plot.
Well, I mean, it has to deal with race, but it also has to do with individuality.
Yeah, well, because everything turns into color, right? Because it goes from black and white to color.
Yes. Hi, guys. Don't forget that I like movies, so I'll bring up movies from time to time.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in a while. I remember the soundtrack being good, regardless.
I mean, then again, it's like the problem with the hero's journey. We can also, now I can look at Star Wars and how, like, in the beginning, Luke is this very, like, happy-go-lucky boy. He's like, I'm going to take on the Empire all by myself. And by the end of the original Star Wars movie, 1977, is that his friend dies and his mentor dies, and by the end of it, he's a changed person. So when Empire Strikes Back, he's more of a cautious individual, and he's not as optimistic on taking on the Empire because he has seen so much death and turmoil in his life already. That's
also definitely a big thing in the hero's journey too, is like in your process of becoming a hero, you also become
cynical.
Yeah, you become jaded or whatever. You get changed in some way because you witness a lot of death and bad things happening. Which is, now that's like kind of making me sad because I have a feeling like there's going to be just more bad things are going to happen to Percy in order for him to like, grow as a character.
Well, I mean, okay, it's not going to be like, so you can also then you have the character arc of Luke Skywalker, where in The Last Jedi, he's this jaded person because, the cycle of the Wheel of Time just keeps turning over and over again, where conflict is always going to happen. But, as long as you have hope, anything can happen.
Again, a super common theme, especially in basically any story that wants to have a vaguely, maybe not happy ending, but just like an ending that...
a bittersweet ending.
Yeah, an ending that gives some extent of hope or something. Yeah, which is, I mean, like, they try to put that in kids' books, except for Unfortunate Events, which is very intentionally...
It's like, F you, did the boat sink?
It literally, like, I think maybe one of the first things that they say is, this does not have a happy ending.
No, that's what I remember when people, when people used to get really mad, like, why does this book not have a happy ending? Well, he did say in the first 13 books. Yeah, they're not happy endings.
Yeah, it's like, it's really funny that they just thought it was marketing. It's like, dude, no, really, that's what they're saying. There's pretty much someone dies in every book at one point.
And then there's very little happy things happened in the lives of the Baudelaire orphans.
It's like one of the first lines. Like,
he also tells you if you don't like this book, just put it down.
Yeah. I mean, I guess people think he's, like, being silly. I mean, he is being silly, but also that's what's happening. It's a sad story.
Well, I mean, okay, then you get into the psychology of, like, you want everything in the end of every story to be okay. Like, you want characters pretty much...
Which is exactly why Unfortunate Events exists as a series. Because it's like, oh, I'm trying to make a series that subverts the idea that every kid's story has to be kind of neatly wrapped up. Sure, sad things happen, but there's sort of like this implied triumph
of individuality because Violet, Klaus, and Sunny grow as individuals
over evil or something. Yeah, or like of love, of friendship. In the end, it was the power of friendship that saved it, or whatever.
None of that happened, especially in Series of Unfortunate Events.
Yeah, but instead it's like at the end of those books, it's sort of just like everyone looks around at all the collateral damage and goes, okay, well, what does this mean? What does this mean about me? Am I a good person because I did these things? Like, you know.
Yeah, again, it's the journey beats the destination.
A lot of YA books don't really pause to think that, right? Like, there isn't a moment where Harry is just like, oh, have I become a monster because I have, you know what I mean? Like, there's not really that moment.
We could just keep going on and on about this because it's really much like an internal philosophical debate about one's morals. Does the ends justify the means?
Yeah, that's true. Which is like, in advertised to children, any kind of like YA book, almost always the ends justify the means. Like, it's almost always like, oh, but you're a good person, so you can do whatever you want.
But then if you could look at like books like Goosebumps and how most of these people are going to become like psychologically damaged by the end of these books.
Yeah, even if like they do defeat the mummy or whatever the heck happens, it's still like, okay, but you just went through a really rough time.
And also, like, as a kid, like, going through all these horrific things, such as Percy Jackson fighting monsters and stuff, as an adult, he is essentially, like, going to be messed up for the rest of his life.
I mean, he already has some trauma. I mean, again, it's pretty well implied that his mom isn't dead, but she's, like, in the underworld. That must do some damage to your psyche to have your mom go to the underworld. Like, I have a feeling that there's going to be some sort of plot about him trying to retrieve her in some way. I don't know if that's going to happen sooner rather than later, but, I mean, it's kind of set up that way.
Yeah, no, especially when it comes to the story, we're going to find a lot of things, especially if you know... I know you, B, don't know the classics. Classic Greek structures of tragedy, comedy, and satyr plays. A lot of the core themes of the Greek classics will come to play in the story in one of the books one way or another. So you'll find, you know, a lot of like the hero's struggle, the hero's choice. Yeah,
similar journeys basically, but it'll just be adjusted to Percy's life. Yeah, that makes sense. Again, this is like a super didactic book as far as like teaching kids.
And here we are just trying to talk about it and like, you know, the equivalent is we're trying to talk about this kid's book as if like we're trying to exterminate an ant with an atomic bomb.
I mean, like, you did ask for someone who studied children's literature in college to be your co-host, so this is kind of what you were...
Well, people are like, oh, I want to talk... So I think the one thing people have told us is, like, they've never really thought of these books in this way, is I think that's a good... having these arguments are really important because you can look at kids' books at face value and get a lot of, like, take away what you want. Like, oh, this is kids' humor and stuff. But then you can also look at them through a different perspective and you get, like, this huge structure of pain and turmoil and this is not how the story goes type of feel. And then you can look at it from different, like, from the Greek myth perspective and how they incorporate the kids.
Yeah, especially because it's based so... keeping in mind, like, Greek myths, which have existed for a very long time, or...
I think you can look at it as a book just for kids, but to another person, they can look at a book just about how a kid conquers his disabilities. You can look at it from the perspective of a kid learning mythology in, like, an informational but fun way. You can look at it from, you know, kid dynamic and looking at how, like, broken a kid can be, but really overcoming that. Like, there's so many different... underlying themes that kind of make like a Percy Jackson sandwich.
Leading up to this book being written that led it to be written in the way that it was, there had to be a certain idea of how YA lit is written at the time, which has a lot to do with Harry Potter and other books that were popular when this book was first published. It also has something like the fact that the main character has dyslexia and ADD. It had to be in the wake of people being more accepting and understanding of those learning disabilities well before people were way more ignorant of those things. There's a lot of stuff leading up to why this book exists the way it does. Basically.
Also, this is not really a spoiler for you, Pete, but as well as the books go on, it becomes much more progressive. So you'll get to the point of where we're talking about issues now in these books, and these were books written about 10 years ago. And
they just happen to touch upon issues that are relevant now, is what you're saying?
There actually is a non-binary character, and there's also a gay character, and there's also ideas of racism, sexism.
Yeah, which is also incredibly important to talk about, I guess, I feel especially things aimed for kids. I think that's why what kind of bothers me when I say, oh, I studied children's literature in school, and people are like, oh, but why does that matter? Do you know what I mean? They act like
because essentially you are reading or you're teaching kids ways to grow up so they become their own individual. These are the stepping stones of that.
Yeah, well, I think the books that I read when I was a kid definitely informed who I am as a person now. And I think that most people would say that, especially people of our generation who grew up on a lot of, different chapter books that were popular when we were kids. I think Hunger Games was a little bit later for me, but I bet there's kids who were very influenced by that series when they were actually, it's funny that I'd say that because that's basically a story about a bunch of kids rebelling against the status quo and being oh, we don't want to
essentially die anymore for your pleasure.
There are literally people like the Parkland students who are basically the kids who grew up reading something like the Hunger Games, and that's exactly what they're doing. Is following that roadmap of how to behave. It's really weird because when people talk about kids' books, they're very critical of how didactic they are, very critical of how they teach different lessons. But books for adults do that all the time. They might not spoon feed it to you in such a ham-fisted manner where this is the right thing to do or whatever, which is definitely more common in worse young adult children's books, whatever, where it's oh, they don't really finesse the way in which that they explain what you should be learning from the story. But
I think the best way to put it is that kids are more ignorant than adults at times, not saying all the time,
or whatever, they don't know as much about the world yet because they haven't experienced it.
So just kind of to wrap it around of what we're talking about here, this bloated explanation is that Percy Jackson, the Olympians, or any young adult books is you can look at any book in a completely different way, and you can come at it from multiple angles, and in the end you'll find everyone will find something about the book that they like or not, because I don't think it's a Ray Bradbury quote, but it's if you pick up a book and you can't finish it, you just haven't found the right book yet. So Annabeth starts, taking Percy around and giving him the tour of, the random things such as, the armory again, the archery range, the active volcano that is really an obstacle course, active volcano.
Maybe not the best choice in terms of just your camp, but whatever, I'm not judging.
And Annabeth's here, this is the nuclear reactor we use to power the whole place. Did we mention that we live on 3 Mile Island? And, that's where, we get into the idea of, Percy is a demigod. And, essentially, I think this is also kind of a weird tipsy-turvy thing where it's essentially, really to understand who your parent is, they actually have to, claim you a weird, divorce hearing.
Yeah, or, I don't know, a lost puppy or something. Yeah, this is mine.
Has anyone seen this child? Oh, that's my doofus of a kid.
Yeah, and it very rarely happens from what I understand, right? A lot of people just don't.
And some people are really sad, when they get to Hermione's cabin, some people are just really sad and miserable. I can imagine this backfiring and seeing how this could probably backfire, as well as again, this comes back to the argument of having really messed up kids, because essentially either your dad or your mom pretty much walk out on you, and you're trying to you're trying to get their interests, senpai notice me, but even as a god, it's impossible to give the attention of your kids.
Well, I mean, like, it's implied that basically they have a bunch of kids that they couldn't even possibly keep track of, right?
Yeah, which then it comes down to, like, one of the arguments of the gods is stop being so thirsty.
Yeah, stop having kids. I mean, it's also really funny, too, because, like, the implication is, like, they say, like, oh, they fall in love with mortals.
There is a brand of condoms called Trojans.
Yeah, basically, it's weird because the way that they refer to it is like, oh, yeah, gods sometimes fall in love with mortals. And it's like, do they fall in love, really?
No, okay, so to all you youngins out here, so essentially the gods come down and then they do, they have the text talk of, what is it, cucumber, water, teardrop emoji.
Okay, son.
Okay, sign.
100, 100.
That's how a baby's born. I am not your mommy or your daddy, so I'm not going to explain how, procreation works. Eventually someone will tell you about it in a really awkward
Sometimes
way.
An eggplant emoji and a teardrop emoji love each other very much.
Okay, then we can get into, like, the more sad, depressing thing of essentially Camp Half-Blood is a foster home.
It is, kind of, right? Like, because they're all these, like, abandoned children. Talk about children's books having a bunch of orphans. Like, all of these kids are just abandoned.
Yeah, and some of them don't know their parents. Some of them run away from their parents. Like, imagine, like, the mom and the dad has to give their kid to this camp that's vaguely culty.
Yeah.
Basically, for their own protection.
The other super weird thing is that apparently Dionysus has a bunch of, like, weird fat little kids that hang out with him, too, at this camp that they imply in this chapter.
And then he's stuck there, and I guess he's kind of like a rude person, so it's like...
Yeah, it's like he doesn't seem like the best dad. Like, maybe someone else can take over. It's like, okay, so if you are vaguely demigod or whatever, your choices are either usually your parent isn't going to come to find you or care about you, or you're Dionysus's kid and he's kind of a jerk and you get to live with him on Camp Half-Blood forever.
Or your parent claims you and then that's pretty much it for the rest of your life. Now you know who your dad is.
Do they explain what happens when your parent claims you? Like, does that provide any sort of protection or... Okay, they'll get to it.
They'll get to it. It should be in a couple chapters.
Do you die? No, I don't know.
It's essentially like the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter.
After all of this sort of explaining that Annabeth does...
Because we also find out that Annabeth, we actually find her parent, or god parentage. She's related to Athena, god of wisdom and war.
God of wisdom and war. Definitely knew that off the top of my head. I didn't.
We also found out where Mount Olympus is. Do you know where it is, B? Hey, B, do you know where Mount Olympus is?
Well, I'm from New York, so clearly it's the Empire State Building. I've seen it before.
Oh, no, I was going to say the Chrysler Building. But yeah, that's a good choice. Why do you think King Kong climbed up of it?
Because he's a mythical monster who's trying to destroy Mount Olympus. Now, there's a fan fiction I want someone to write.
And you know what? You found him. Well, then they take a good old trip back to the Hermes cabin. Because, it's been one heck of a day. Because Percy's, mom disappeared. And he's learning all this new stuff. It's been a long... Just imagine, honey, I'm home. I've had one heck of a day.
Well, I guess it's been 2 days, right? How long has he been unconscious? Has it been an entire day, or...?
I think it's been like a day or two.
Okay, so yeah, it's been a little while.
We also find out, Hermes is the god of messengers, medicine, travelers, merchants, and thieves. That's why anyone that isn't claimed by a parent...
They go there because they're travelers. But also it's like they're stressed out about that cabin because thieves. And so everyone is kind of like... has a little bit of the 5-finger discount situation where they're just like eyeing other people's stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to be in that cabin. I feel like you'd have to have like a lockbox, but then again, they probably break into it.
Yeah, it's like so dumb. It's like, okay, all of our new campers go to the cabin full of thieves.
If you have anything valuable, don't have them on you. That's when he also, Percy starts talking to Luke, and Luke starts talking to him about prophecies and how they're not really a big deal, but, people like take them very seriously.
Like Annabeth takes the prophecy very seriously.
Which, yes, because she used to annoy Creon so much that I guess Creon has a prophecy about her.
Yeah, well, like, basically, she's hoping that Percy is the person that she's been looking for, because there's something in her prophecy that she's waiting for another person to go on this sort of adventure with, and so every new camper she thinks is going to be that person. I think it's pretty clear that Percy's going to be, probably, because he's the main character.
I wonder why. I mean, this book is called Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I mean, that is. Can I say, B? Is that like a fair assumption that he might be the person?
It's a fair assumption because
it's an educated guess.
I mean, at first they say, "Oh, well, I don't," It says, "Don't worry about a kid," Luke said. "Annabeth wants to think every new camper who comes through here is the omen she's been waiting for." But, like, of course, he is the omen she's been waiting for, because he's the main character, and we know that he's important, so, clearly.
And then that's when the magic conch is blown.
Oh, yeah, and then it's time for dinner at the mess hall pavilion where...
Pavilion. So while they're at dinner, Percy and all the people, like, they start getting their food, and this is one of my favorite parts, is Percy, like, they get their goblets, and it's like, oh, you can have whatever drink you want. Non-alcoholic, of course, and Percy's like, I want cherry Coke. Wait, make it blue. And it just happens.
Yeah, this is like because I just watched Coraline with Tyler. This totally, yeah, it totally is like that scene in Coraline when she's like, "What do you want?" She's like, "Mango milkshake."
Hey, I like mango milkshakes, but you know what the funny thing is, B?
Yeah.
I'd be like, what type of drink would you want, B?
Basically, it's funny because like that totally would be the drink that I would ask for. I mean, like not a milkshake, but like a mango lassi is like one of my favorite drinks, which is essentially a mango milkshake. It's pretty close to it's more of a mango smoothie, I guess. Yeah, Coraline made a good decision. I would totally want a mango milkshake. That sounds delicious. I want one right now.
Here, I'm the exact opposite. I just want a root beer.
Would you want a root beer?
Yeah, I like root beer. It's actually my favorite soda.
You're like Lemony Snicket.
That's actually, I liked root beer before Lemony Snicket liked root beer.
I liked it before it was cool.
It's either that or getting horchata.
I'm not like the biggest fan of horchata.
But I have to make the root beer, I'd have to turn it green or something exotic. And I'd ask, it's like, try to like see the parameters. Like, I also want to have a umbrella Hawaiian theme to this. Bink. Oh.
Yeah, that's fun. We used to have drink umbrellas just like in my kitchen, and I would just put it in like every drink I had.
Be fancy.
We just like made it festive. I was like, yeah, here's my glass of boring water with a little umbrella in it.
It just adds to the sweetness.
Yeah, it does. It makes it snazzy. I love those little umbrellas.
This is where it's like, hey guys, take a drink of your non-alcoholic beverage, please. But, you know, as that's happening, Percy notices that people are getting up with their food. Because, you know, this is like the great hall. It's a great feast. Except, you know, they're doing like burnt offerings.
Yeah, so he's like confused about why they're doing that. You basically take the most delicious part of your food.
You mean the saddest part of your food?
Yeah, no, I would totally be bummed out by that too. I'd be like, oh, look at it, it's delicious. Now I'm just excited for the food I'm going to have at Easter. I'm just like really hype about it. Anyway.
look at it go. Like the most butteriest of bread, of the roll, like the thickest, juiciest part of the brisket, because this is, you know, New York.
Yeah, delicious.
Good old brisket. What?
So good.
That's when, you know, Percy's like, whoever it is, whoever my dad is, please phone home.
Yeah.
And kind of like the chapter kind of ends with, you know, Percy going back to his bed in Hermione's cabin, holding the Minotaur horn, and then slowly drifting off to sleep for his first official day.
Saying, dun dun dun, I wish I had known how briefly I would get to enjoy my new home. So there's like some foreshadowing there that some stuff goes down, which I mean, I guess like this can't all just be a slice of life anime where they just whimsically like live at this camp. Like there obviously has to be some conflict. A whimsical, fluffy fan fiction or something. I'm sure that also exists for Percy Jackson, if you want to find that.
Like a slice of life.
Mm-hmm. Just them hanging out, having a nice time.
I think that's actually in a lot of the supplemental material, because there actually are books like Tales from Camp Half-Blood.
Yeah, where it's just them hanging out. It's like more exposition stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. And like character development.
I kind of really love that.
It's Percy Jackson Olympians, the Demigod Files.
I feel like I would have a nice time reading that, because I like stories like that. It's kind of nice to like have a break from like conflict and like just have character development.
Oh, so it's kind of, I consider it like, I always like the Ember Island Players as one of the greatest episodes of TV history from Avatar: Last Airbender.
I'm not sure I've seen
That's
that episode.
That's the one before the last episode where they see the play about themselves and they're just commenting about how bad it is.
Oh yeah, that's funny.
Where they're watching it's a recap episode about the whole series, but it's done completely wrong. And the whole characters are making their observations about, like, my scar's not on that side.
That's cute. I like that. Yeah, I like slice of life things. I think it's fun.
Well, I mean, I think it humanizes. I think that's the main thing. Like, not every day you have conflict in your life.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, you're not always off to fight a very complicated giant, like, quest that you have been destined to do since you were a child or whatever.
Like, there's sometimes to kick back and go to the beach.
That sounds nice.
So, B, what did you think of this chapter?
I like this chapter. Again, we've talked about the downfalls of reading a chapter at a time every week, and it's like really excruciatingly slow in terms of like development and seeing what happens next. And like if I was reading this normally, I would read ahead and like find out more stuff about what's going on. Even so, this was like a satisfying chapter in terms of like explaining some of like the world building stuff, some of the devices that work within Camp Half-Blood. You got to meet a few characters or like get reacquainted with characters and like learn more about them. I thought it was like a good little slice of like what it would be like to go to Camp Half-Blood, which of course is like kind of a good lead up, I guess, to things changing and it not being so laid back and it leading to something a little bit more adventurous, as it implies in the last line that things aren't going to be so, you know, sunshine and rainbows or whatever. It's not going to be that, obviously, because this is like implied to be an action book, so it's not going to be that the whole time, but it's nice that they set that up. I'm really excited to see what happens next. I want to, you know, follow up some threads on what we've seen so far. I want to see something about what the heck is in that attic that Chiron kind of avoided. I want to see Percy means by it not being, maybe not appreciating the fact that things are going to get like less whimsical as things go on in Camp Half-Blood. Like I want to see just a follow up on that, basically, which obviously it's kind of setting itself up for that.
For me, I like this chapter in the ways of, like, we finally get the answers of, oh, Percy's a demigod, and this is kind of like how the structure of the world works. You know, if you really think of it that way, that's fine. But if you think of it the way we just talked about, and it's how it's, like, essentially being a demigod might not be the best thing for some people.
Yeah, it also, it explains the downside of that, too. Yeah, you hear a lot of, like, the stressors of being a half-blood, you know, like how Annabeth is, you know, worried about the Oracle and what her place in life is and who Percy is and whether or not he factors in.
Which, you know, I've talked about this before and how, like, a lot of Greek plays, especially, like, I'll just use Back to the Future as, in Back to the Future, Doc wants nothing to know about the future because you can inadvertently cause that future to happen rather than letting it, you know, natural course of time happen. And which, you know, if you know what's like, people want to know like when they're gonna die, I'm like, I don't.
Yeah, I would never want to know that,
because then you know when the day is gonna come.
Yeah, because they'd be like, oh, well, you drowned, so then I would like never go to the ocean. Do you know what I mean? Like you would just avoid things.
But then you would inadvertently drown in your bathtub.
Yeah, exactly. I would just want to live my life. I wouldn't want to know. Also, I would just live in total fear my whole life.
Oh my god, it's like, you can look at Macbeth, and it's the same way. It's like, you have this prophecy as a like, the forest is never going to come here. Oh, it certainly does.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you get like these ideas of, you know, prophecy. We get like the idea of that there's a big prophecy, and that Creon kind of told Annabeth about.
Yeah, and there's also like an individual kind of like, everyone has their own place.
There's always like a big prophecy, and then I guess there's like little individual prophecies. People get like fortune cookies.
You will have a great day today. Oh, it wasn't right at all. I was attacked by a minotaur, and my mom was sent to the underworld.
But I mean, there's so many great things about this little chapter. Especially, again, you kind of learn more about Hermes' cabin. You get to learn more about like what it's like, just a regular day to day of like, oh, this is kind of like we get food and all this wonderful stuff.
Yeah, it was a nice chapter.
But then there's, like, also the underlying things, if you really think about it. Like, also that everyone's essentially cousins.
Yeah, that's true, too. Everyone's vaguely related. Ugh.
I believe they address it in one of these books. And, like, there's, like, some reason why it's okay to, like, date each other.
Is it? Okay.
I think there's actually, like, a reason, like, their DNA isn't quite the same.
Okay, still weird. I'd still feel weird about it.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of interesting things, and there's going to be more things that are coming up with this series. What do you think is going to happen next, B?
I mean, I feel like they're going to follow up on a lot of the stuff that they already talked about. I feel like, hopefully, they're going to... Percy's going to talk to Chiron again and try to have a follow-up about Grover and what happened to him. I hope that happens soon. I think there's probably going to be some sort of change or dire thing that introduces itself to the camp somehow. Whether that's fully revealed in the next chapter, I don't know. But it seems like a big storm's coming somehow. Other than that, I don't know what else I could predict. I predict that maybe Annabeth and Percy become closer. Yeah, because they're probably intertwined in each other's destiny or whatever in some respect.
So we actually got some wonderful iTunes reviews since last episode, and we're so excited for that. So thank you guys for submitting iTunes reviews. We really appreciate it. It's easy to send iTunes reviews. Someone actually sends like they don't have an iTunes account. That's okay. If you don't have an iTunes account, you can actually email reviews, and we'll just read them on the show, and we'll read them on air. So you can email us at radiocamphalfblood@gmail.com. So the first one is from Sam394. I'm loving the show. It's just spectacular. Enough said.
Nice. To the point. Very sweet.
Thank you, Sam. Very sweet. So the other one we have is from Half-Blood Greek or Geek. So great podcast. 5 stars. It's a great podcast. I just read the whole series and watched the. They put it in like marks. Mediocre movie. I just think of like a Morton Joe. Mediocre. So I wanted to see what other people thought about this wonderful series of books. All around, this is just a great podcast. Thanks, Half-Blood Geek.
Nice. Very friendly.
So, B, where can they find you?
I'm at B. Kelly Gorman on Twitter, and I am twinpoetry.tumblr.com on the Tumbles. And I'm also co-host with my friend Tyler on Unfortunate Associates. Tonight at midnight, the new season of a series of unfortunate events is coming out on Netflix.
Yeah.
And we will very soon have a new episode up about that, and I am screaming internally with excitement. So
we're all super excited. We're actually, both of us are going to be talking about it, the first episode.
And you should join all of us soon. I'm not exactly sure when we'll have the episode up, but it'll definitely be pretty close to when the series comes out. Yeah, I'm really, really hype about it. I'm like counting down the hours, basically.
Yep, I gotta go to work, and then right afterwards, I'm gonna be up all night like I did last time and just have an all-night binger.
Yeah. I mean, last time I stayed up all night and watched the first episode, and then I made myself go to bed.
Me, I was the exact opposite, and both, I think Tyler and you called me a madman. Because you guys were recording the next night.
And you watched like the whole thing. You just continuously through the night. I would not do that to my body. Also, I have stuff to do this weekend, but regardless, now would be a really great time to hop on to the show.
And when we do talk about Series of Unfortunate Events quite a lot, so if you haven't read that series, might as well just start, because then you'll get a half of our references.
Yeah, you'll probably understand a lot of what I'm saying a lot more if you understand Lemony Snicket books.
If you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me at Suda41, that's SUDA41. If you want to follow our show on Twitter, that's halfblood_radio. If you want to email the show and send us amazing messages, such as what we've gotten in the past, you can email us at radiocamphalfblood@gmail.com, or you can follow us on most social media sites now, as well as anywhere the podcasts are, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify.
Yeah, we're everywhere.
That weird phantom number station we usually play an episode once every night. You just have to go look for it.
Yeah, just find it.
You'll find it.
We're out there.
I think that wraps up the episode, B.
Yep, sure does.
I'm Zach.
I'm B.
And keep staying mortal. Bye!
See ya!